When we started off FOV about 8 years ago, one of the challenges that we were looking at is what is the future we want? How do we want to collectively create this future? Given the context of India, on the street that our office is in, you'll find people who earn as little as a few hundred rupees to people who earn a few lakh rupees a month. So when you have this spread in terms of just pure economic diversity, how do you balance your options out? It requires participation. It requires people speaking with each other. How do you create tools that can let us think about the future, that lets us articulate what is the future that we want?
One thing became very apparent is that when it comes to public policy, we really don't have proper tools that make sense in the Indian context. There is so much amount of data related to policy, but what can we even do with this data? How can we make this actionable? What was needed is a bridge organization. So we said, hey, maybe Fields of View can be that bridge organization. So that's how the idea of Fields of View is conceived.
A lot of times it's hard for people to even express what they are talking about, to respond to dense documents. That way, say, games can provide a less imposing environment for people in which they are able to express what they are thinking, and thereby we understand the preferences of those who are affected by it. And that we can do not only with the government, saving them time and money, but also with the people, where they can say maybe come up with scenarios they would like to see and help them understand what are the consequences of any decision they make.
The simulation we use here are more of a generative simulations. The idea here is to explore various what-if questions, because there is no one right answer to policymaking space itself. So how do you think of from a system level what works and what doesn't work? So the simulation we are building here is lets you ask those questions and think of various ways to reach the solution. There's no one fixed pathway to reach there.
But in generative simulations, you generate all possibilities. Assume that, okay, you get the budget you ask for, there is one scenario. You don't get the budget you ask for, there is one scenario. You get half the budget you ask for, there is one scenario. Depending on what happens, you choose one. It's as simple as that. That's what a generative simulation does.
Academic research has its own place and it's very important. But how do you bridge academic research in a way that it makes sense for practical uses?
So nowadays, for the entertainment, TikTok and other social medias mostly use it. Can we use the TikTok and other social media to talk about the public policy? That's what I wanted to do at the Fields of View.
One of our accomplishments as an organization is that more people are using the language of games, more people are using the language of trade-offs, more people are using simulations in their work, especially in the policy world. Because we believe that this method, these tools, these processes have been created to benefit society at large. And the only way we can do that is work with as many people as possible.
Hi, I'm Bharath. I'm from Fields of View in Bangalore in India. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how games can be used in public policy. I'm going to be using examples from over a decade of our work in public policy that ranges all the way from disaster management and that goes all the way up to energy and waste. It's wonderful to be talking to you at Games for Change Asia Pacific about this. When we think about games, we automatically jump to the idea of pedagogical tools because historically they've been used in that context. People tend to think about them as wonderful tools when it comes to learning, largely because they provide a nice platform for learning from failure as well, right? And experiential learning, fairly well documented, extremely well discussed, and lovely examples all across the world. But two other use cases that I will be talking about using our work and the tools that we have created is collecting intangible data and for testing scenarios and policies. When I talk about intangible data, what I mean is the data about preferences, biases that is hard to capture with other traditional methods that exist already. A game is a wonderful way to do that because you are collecting data about people responding to each other. You are collecting data about people responding to the situation in the game and to see and figure out how they manipulate the resources that they have at their disposal. What we see in the real world and what we see happen around us is that as irrational beings, as people who have different preferences, who have different needs, we often have different ways of approaching the problem. A simple example could be I need to travel post COVID, I need to travel to work on a daily basis. The shortest path might be a certain route, but my preference might be to avoid all traffic signals. So I will take a longer route. I'm okay sacrificing another 2 minutes or 3 minutes because I don't want to be stuck in traffic. Or I might have some chores. I might have to pick up some grocery. I might have to drop off some laundry. So I need to go in a different route. Though that's not the most optimum or the most efficient route, I might choose to go in a certain route because it's not a slope on it's a downhill on that route when I'm traveling to work and not an uphill. So all of these different factors come into play, right? Or it could be as simple as the fact that there's this nice, quaint little house that when I walk by or when I cycle by makes me feel happy in the mornings. So I might want to travel in that direction. So because my preferences are so different from on each day, forget with another person, the route that I might take might vary. So what we are talking about is multiple pathways. What we are talking about is different ways of addressing this problem and not really about thinking about the most efficient way of addressing this. So in that context, actually, games are a wonderful tool because games, by very definition, allow us to explore different pathways and allow us to have very different endings in the game. When you have these different pathways and endings, what that means is that as a person playing the game, I get to explore the problem space. I get to explore the solution space. And that makes it easy for me to then grapple with the complexity of the problem. Right? Having said that, I'll talk about a few key concepts in the context of games and public policy and how these help both design better public policy and why games are a good medium to do so. One of them is ownership. When I talk about ownership, I talk about ownership in two different ways. The first one is ownership of actions and the consequences of my actions in the game. The second one is largely looking at ownership of the results, right? Do I believe the results? The believability, which is also tied to validity of the results. The second element is modeling conflicts. As I mentioned, a game allows us to model different kinds of conflicts, right? Conflicts between different individuals, conflicts between the system and the game, conflicts within myself as well, my own internal belief systems. By allowing us to model these conflicts, what we allow players to do is experience these conflicts in a setting that might or might not be familiar to them, and therefore explore the consequences of my actions over a longer period of time. The third point is the validity of results. When we think about results from a game session, or when we think about using a game to collect intangible data, to look at learning and training, or even to test scenarios, a key element is how useful a tool is, right? Because after all, you're not playing the game just for the game's sake anymore. You're using the results from the game. There could be different kinds of results later on for other purposes. It could be for improving, let's say, road safety. It could be for improving timings in the context of your own first responders and disaster management. It could be in the context of designing better decentralized systems of waste disposal. So how do you then ensure that the results that you get are valid enough for you to use them in other contexts? The next piece I'll be talking about is how does the game fit? One of the biggest grouses that many people have with the Games for Change community and with people who use games at large is that there is a very innate tendency for all of us to get excited, right? A game is an exciting thing, it's a fun thing. But then often what happens after the game? How does the game fit into the larger scheme of things? Do the results of the game hold even after a year, even after 2 years? Or even after 6 months, or does the value of using the game reduce? Does the utility reduce over a course of time? These are some questions that come into mind, right? And a game is a fairly expensive medium to create. It could be in terms of time, it could be in terms of resources, participants' time, participants' resources. So it's fairly expensive. It's not if you're using it to create awareness, there are better ways to do it, right? For example, for some kinds of awareness, a poster is good. A movie is good because it scales. But when you think about a game, you're asking your players and participants to spend time with you. And if it's a physical game or a physical experience, then you're asking them to come to a certain place and spend 3 hours, 2 hours with you, as opposed to sitting at home and watching a movie or watching a documentary about the same. And now, if you want to reach out to a substantial portion of the population, a simple example is if you want to create a dry waste awareness campaign in Bangalore, the city that I come from. We are talking about a city that has a little over a crore population. So that would, roughly translate to 10 million. So if you need to do a campaign for 10 million people, we are talking about a substantial number of resources that need to be put in, right? When you want to have physical sessions, game sessions. So it's a fairly expensive proposition. So how do you design these games so that they fit in well in the larger scheme of things? And the last one is when we think about games, we often think about sitting on our own or playing, or sitting around with a group of friends and playing, and we forget the role of facilitation. And why does facilitation play an important role is an often underexplored topic when it comes to games in the context of these other two cases, that of data collection and that of scenario testing. While success or failure of a game is also often attributed to the game and to the art of facilitation in itself, or the science of facilitation. So I'll be delving into all of these topics as we move along. The first one, as I mentioned, ownership. In our experience, ownership when it comes to the games comes from three large pieces. One is the rules and game mechanics. The second one is the wrapper that we use, right? The artifacts and the visuals that we use for the games themselves. The rules of the game become important because if they don't mimic what's happening in the real world, ownership could reduce. That's what we often think. But depending on the context, that is the subject matter and the participants or the player group, you can vary that. It is not a strict, it has to be following the real world, but you can move it back towards lesser fidelity. And that helps actually with certain kinds of target audience. The other piece is if a certain action takes me X amount of time in the game world, and does it reflect or mimic what happens in the real world? Again, all of these three parameters is you decide this based on whether you have an audience that needs that level of realism, that level of accountability, or that actually enjoys the fact that it is not as realistic as what happens in the real world, and therefore I'm able to explore different things. This is a game that we created in the context of energy planning. What you see is that these are a bunch of administrative officers in the Indian Civil Service, and they are planning for India's energy future. And what you see them over here is discussing and looking at different policy documents with respect to energy planning, and trying to figure out what their expenditure for energy needs to be over the course of the next 5 years. Now, as you can see, this is the beginning of the game. And when I talked about model fidelity, I talked about model reality, right? We were skeptical because we weren't sure if this will make sense to them. But I think this is a good indicator of the fact that that balance that I was talking about between how realistic something needs to be is where this picture is highly indicative for us, because this is the end of the game where they're discussing whether their plan should work, does not work, and if so, what needs to be changed. And I think for us, this was a big win because it showed us that realism can happen across different things, right? The first one is in this context, we do not have, just going back, we do not have fancy graphics as this. As you can see, they have pen and paper largely. They have a sophisticated spreadsheet in front of them, largely a web interface, but it's essentially a sophisticated spreadsheet that does all the calculations for them to be able to do all the projections in terms of their energy expenditure and the returns on these investments. But what worked here in terms of the rules and the game mechanics was we had mimicked the decision-making process that exists in the energy sector in government of India. So that really helped because it brought in that realism. Now, at the same time here, what happened was because we had used numbers that they're familiar with, 3.29 rupees per kilowatt hour of a certain type of energy source, makes sense to them because these are numbers that they deal with on an everyday basis. So this allowed them to have that hook into the real world and therefore explore different possibilities. But as I mentioned, we need to provide some leeway in order to ensure that the game allows them to experiment and explore different options. by allowing them to explore and experiment different options. As you can see here, these are different departments and ministries that were sitting and discussing their future plans at the beginning of the game session. As you can see at the end of the game session, the silos were broken. And this was not engineered by us as a way to ask these questions. But what we did was, because we had set up these systems as silos that mimic the real world, but we had given them the leeway to break those silos, they automatically came together for the next 5-year plans because they understand the value on an everyday basis of not planning together. So these silos were broken. And that is the ownership that I was talking about or referring to earlier, that this ownership, sense of ownership can come in if the tool is well designed. I'll move on to the next topic, which is looking at modeling conflicts. And as I mentioned, we look at 3 different kinds of conflicts. And often when we think about games and when we talk about games, the first question everybody asks us is, how do we win when we have a game session, right? How do I win? How do I win? But when we tell them, hold your horses, it's not about you winning. It's all of you collectively winning or collectively losing. That paradigm shift is an important thing to think about when designing such games, because in the context of the real world, it's largely collective winning and collective loss, and of different gradations, right? Of two different degrees. And to get them to function in a similar manner in the context of a game is a refreshing experience for many players in of itself, right? And that's the idea with many of these tools as well, to talk about what happens in the real world through a game without talking about it also as a zero-sum game when it is not required. A few examples. This was a game that we have created. It's a trilingual game called Rubbish, Kasukusa, or Kasukupai. As you can see, as the name sort of is self-explanatory, it is about waste and solid waste in the urban Indian cities. It allows people to explore different strategies, right from dealing with a decentralized system of waste disposal in urban India to a centralized system. And therefore, what happens in this context? What are the consequences when we don't plan? In this game, you can see the big dustbin on the left-hand side of the screen. That functions as a landfill, and you will see different colored waste, as you would have seen in the first image as well, which is white, red, and blue. What happens is people need to manage waste in a city, and if they're not able to manage the waste in the city, it goes into the landfill. And the game ends when the landfill is full. And in this game, one of the things that we test is whether people tend towards decentralized systems or people tend towards centralized systems in handling and disposal of waste. And how do they think about cooperation? Why do they cooperate? At what points do they cooperate? And this is where, for example, the conflict has been modeled as both conflict between the players and conflict with the system as well, because there is finite amount of space available for landfills. So the idea in this game is also to unpack those questions and also talk about the fact that it is not a zero-sum game, right? We model it as a zero-sum game, but it's not really a zero-sum game. One of the funniest things that we have seen is the notion that people automatically assume that as our education level increases, as our subject matter expertise increases, in formal systems, right, in very defined, clear, formal mechanisms, we tend to understand all of this better and we address the problem better. But what we've seen in this context, and a validation of what many people have already discussed, is that people who work with waste with their hands on an everyday basis, this could be the sweepers, this could be the power carpenters, this could be the waste workers, they are the ones who have successfully addressed the problem of waste in this context. We've had bankers, we've had waste to energy companies, we've had waste recycling companies, large multinationals as well, not collectively address this problem of waste and actually asking us when they lose the game, asking us why we couldn't buy a second landfill, why we couldn't buy a third landfill. When people who deal with waste on an everyday basis were able to successfully address this problem. And as you can see with the examples that I'm giving you as well, there is different reality that we bring in, different sense in terms of the visual space, in terms of the game mechanics that we bring in. In this game, as an example, all the numbers are based on real world data. It's been abstracted out because on an average, there are, in urban context, just solid waste, you could have 18 to 24 types of waste. But playing that in a game would become very cumbersome. So we would reduce that to 3 types of waste. So in that manner, you find that middle ground that is playable for your target audience. But at the same time, you can see all the assets are very stylized, right? They're only representative. as opposed to, let's say, what I discussed in the energy game, or as opposed to the disaster management context. So in that manner, designing these tools helps draw in your participants, also explore these different conflicts that exist within the system. So as I was mentioning, we played this game with a very different, very diverse set of audience as well. And because the game is designed in such a manner that it's largely numerical literacy that is required, we're able to play it. And as you can see, this was the Tamil version of the game. And we have people who work with waste on an everyday basis trying to address the problem of waste in this game. I talked about validity of results. Just to quickly wrap up validity, how do you use the game results, and does it make sense to use the game results? I'll give you a couple of examples. We talked about model fidelity. This is another example where we get people to build the city that they want to live in. And as you can see, we use highly abstract elements. But here we are not worried about the spatial construction of these elements as much as, for example, we've had over 200 runs of this game where people construct the city that they live in. And these are people, as you can see in the image, who are 5-year-old, 10-year-old men, women, children, experienced professionals, urban planners, academics, bureaucrats who are part of different civic bodies, all built the game, and across different nationalities, as you can see from the picture as well. And over 200 runs, right? But we've had less than 5 sessions where people have built police stations. So this is the intangible data that I was referring to earlier that you can collect with games when they're designed well. And this intangible data is fairly useful for us when we talk about urban planning in this game, right? Because what it's telling us is people don't prioritize across the board. If only 5 cities had police stations, that's a very strong indicator of the fact that people don't prioritize the police when it comes to cities. It could be for a number of reasons, but that's a good insight and a good starting point to start unpacking that data. Another observation with games like this, as I was talking about expertise earlier, is when as age increases, to put it mildly, as we grow older, we become experts, right? We learn more, we understand more, we specialize in certain subject matters. What that also means is that our space for exploration actually starts reducing. As an example, we have, as I mentioned, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, all the way up to 70-year-olds playing the game. We've seen that with 5-year-olds, there is more discussion. As age increases, the discussion reduces to a point where it is largely about why did you place something there? Why did you construct something in that city, in that spot? I needed to use that space, right? So that means that the idea of collaborating across cultures, across age groups, starts to reduce as we grow older. And this is an important thing also for us to be conscious about in contexts such as urban planning, because without collaboration, it does not function well. Right? The results are reflective of what we see on the ground. This is another game that we have created with data about urban poverty and in the context of garment workers in the case of Bangalore. And we looked at 3 specific pieces. That is, how does the idea of caste, class, and gender, how does that play a role when it comes to thinking about urban planning itself, especially when it is about livelihoods, when it is about mobility, when it is about aspirations. So that's how this game was created. And this again is an example of how the results are about both modeling the internal conflicts and the validity of the results, because it is about taking data that is otherwise not accessible to a large section of the population and not easily understandable, to then internalizing it myself, to ask my own questions about how does privilege play? Why am I in this position? Because as an example, when we play this game, we've had people talking about how, as professionals in labor law, they did not internalize the effects of the lack of social protection until they played this game. Another game is a planning game that we created. One of our partners that is presenting at this conference also is UNESCO NGIB. And this was a game that was created to look at the Inclusive Wealth Index and to understand how the Inclusive Wealth Index would function as a planning tool. So instead of preaching to the converted, we thought it might be useful to talk about human capital and produced capital and natural capital together to people just entering the policy making space rather than people who are already in the policy making space. So this is a training tool. So when it is a training tool, the validity of the results have become extremely critical for both a buy-in from the players and the participants, as well as learning outcomes for the players and the participants. Typically, when we talk about a game, we restrict ourselves to the second phase, which is gameplay. But in the context of games as tools, I think two other pieces that become critical that are often talked about as well is briefing as well as the debriefing. Because as all of us know right now, a lot of the learning, a lot of the internalization does not happen during the gameplay session, but happens during the debrief session. And in our context, for many of our games as well, we see that the debrief session is often longer than the game session itself. And that's why a facilitator becomes important in this context. And what we also have to figure out, because we are embedding these tools in a larger process, is where is the game useful? How do we find out if there are different objective outcomes? And therefore, what are the kind of conflict that exist in the problem? And therefore, what can be modeled in the game? And how is the game fitting in this whole process of who has a problem, what is the problem, and where can the game be used, right? So that becomes a crucial portion for us. As an example, this is a game on public transport and planning for better public transport in the urban context. This is with the government body. This is actually a photograph of a public transport service provider, and them using the tool to plan for different routes and to look at the trade-offs when it comes to planning different routes in the context of the fact that expenditure on public transport itself is a highly contested topic in India. And this is the same game that was also played with civil society members and organizations to understand from their perspective what would their needs be. So this is actually embedding a tool in two different places. One is as a tool for engagement with diverse stakeholders, and the second one is to use the results from the tool in itself to design better routes, for example, and plan for different kinds of routes and prioritize these routes. So this is what I mean largely by thinking about games as not standalone games, right? And this becomes important because when they're not standalone games, also when they are when they deal with such complex subject matter, we also need a facilitator. And a few key things when we talk about facilitation and standalone games is the idea that we need a certain structured skill sets when it comes to understanding the data, understanding what is happening in the game, and then using the results. At the same time, the debrief session that I talked about, how do you ensure that you can ask the right questions? How do you structure that in a manner that makes the debrief session useful for the participants? Because that's where a lot of the internalizing, a lot of the learning post-game happens. This is a promotional slide about our work, but do feel free to reach out to us. These are a few of our partners, and this is some coverage about our work. Do feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to know more about how games can be used in the context of public policy. Thank you.